Wrangel Island sits in the Arctic Ocean, north of Siberia and west of Alaska, separated from both continents by wide stretches of water that freeze and break apart with the seasons. It is not large by Arctic standards, but it is remote even within that category. For much of the year, the island is surrounded by drifting pack ice. In winter, the sea hardens into a continuous white field. In summer, the ice loosens, but ships still struggle to approach its rocky shore. The island's terrain is uneven and exposed. Low mountains run across its center, rising above coastal plains that are often locked in permafrost. The ground supports little vegetation beyond mosses, grasses, and scattered flowering plants that appear briefly during the short summer. There are no trees. Wind moves across the island without obstruction, carrying snow in winter and fine grit in warmer months. The landscape changes slowly, shaped less by sudden events than by long pressure from cold and wind. Animal life exists in narrow balance with the environment. Polar bears pass through seasonally, following the movement of sea ice. Arctic foxes remain year-round, adapting to scarcity with caution and patience. Birds arrive in large numbers during the brief thaw, nesting along cliffs and low ridges before departing again. Walruses haul out along the coast when conditions allow. These patterns repeat with little variation from year to year. Human presence on Wrangel Island has never been permanent. Indigenous peoples from Siberia and Alaska knew of the island and reached it occasionally, but it was never settled. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, explorers, traders, and governments viewed it as a strategic location rather than a livable one. Expeditions came and went. Most stayed only as long as necessary. When they left, the island returned to its prior state of isolation. Sound behaves differently in such places. Wind replaces the usual markers of human activity. There are no roads, no machinery, no distant signs of population. During calm periods, the silence can feel complete. Time passes without obvious reference points. Days are measured by light and temperature rather than clocks or schedules. In winter, darkness dominates. In summer, the sun remains above the horizon, circling without setting. This environment does not announce danger immediately. It appears stable even still, but it offers little margin for error. Survival here depends on preparation, restraint, and an understanding that help does not arrive quickly. Once a person is placed on Wrangel Island, the distance from the rest of the world becomes absolute. The island does not adapt to those who come to it. It remains unchanged, indifferent, and alone. Ada Blackjack was born in 1898 in a small Inupiat community near Cape Nome, Alaska. Her early life unfolded during a period of rapid change for Native communities in the region. Gold rush activity had altered local economies and introduced new systems of labor and dependency. Traditional subsistence practices continued, but they existed alongside increasing pressure to engage with wage work and colonial institutions. Ada lost her parents at a young age. As a result, she spent part of her childhood moving between households and missions. She learned basic domestic skills, including sewing, cooking, and mending, which were valued forms of labor in both native and settler communities. Her education was limited. English was not her first language, and her literacy remained minimal throughout her life. In 1918, Ada married Jack Blackjack, an Inupiat man from the same region. The marriage was brief and unstable. Jack Blackjack left soon after their son, Bennett, was born. Ada was left to raise the child alone. Bennett developed tuberculosis, a common and often fatal illness in Alaska at the time. Treatment options were limited and expensive. Ada's priority became securing enough income to keep her son in medical care. Work opportunities for Indigenous women were narrow. Ada found employment primarily as a seamstress and domestic helper. These positions paid little, but they offered continuity. When recruiters began assembling a small group for a planned expedition to Wrangel Island in 1921, Ada was approached to serve as a cook and general laborer. The position did not require technical experience. It promised steady pay and the possibility of additional income if the expedition succeeded. Ada did not join as an explorer. She was not trained in navigation, hunting, or Arctic survival. Her role was defined in practical terms. She would prepare food, maintain clothing, and manage daily household tasks for the group. These were responsibilities she already understood. The dangers of the location were explained in broad terms, but the expedition was presented as temporary and organized. There was an assumption of regular resupply and eventual return. The decision to go was shaped by necessity rather than ambition. Bennett remained in treatment in Nome. Ada needed money more than security. The contract she signed reflected this imbalance. It offered wages but little protection. There is no record that she fully understood how isolated Wrangel Island was or how dependent the group would be on outside support. When Ada agreed to leave Alaska, she did so with the expectation that she would be gone for a limited period. Her focus remained on her son. Survival at that point was not yet a concept tied to her own life. It was a calculation about work, distance, and return. The Wrangel Island expedition was organized in 1921 under the direction of Vilhjalmur Stephenson, an Arctic explorer who believed the island could be claimed and permanently occupied. His interest in Wrangel Island was political as well as geographic. At the time, sovereignty over the island was uncertain. Russia, Canada, and the United States all had overlapping interests in the region. Stephenson believed that a small civilian party could establish a presence that would later be recognized as legitimate control. The group selected for the expedition was small. It consisted of 4 young men and 1 woman. The men were Alan Crawford, Lorne Knight, Fred Maurer, and Milton Gall. None of them had extensive experience living independently in the high Arctic. Their preparation relied heavily on Stephenson's confidence that the island was rich in game and that survival would be manageable with basic equipment and discipline. Supplies were loaded with the expectation of annual resupply. Rifles, ammunition, preserved food, and clothing were included, but not in quantities sufficient for indefinite isolation. The plan assumed that a ship would return the following summer with additional provisions. This assumption shaped every decision made before departure. It allowed for optimism and reduced caution. Ada Blackjack's role was strictly defined. She was to cook, sew, and assist with camp maintenance. She was not expected to hunt. She was not trained in the use of firearms. Her inclusion was justified on the basis that domestic labor would free the men to focus on exploration and claims of occupation. This division of responsibility reflected both gender and racial hierarchies common at the time. In September 1921, the expedition reached Wrangel Island by ship. They unloaded their supplies and established a base near the coast. As the ship departed, the group was left alone with their equipment and their assumptions. The first weeks were occupied with organizing camp, erecting shelters, and taking inventory of food and fuel. There was no immediate sense of urgency. The island did not resist their arrival. Weather conditions were stable. Game was present. The men began mapping parts of the terrain and documenting their presence through journals and photographs. The work was slow but orderly. There was confidence that the coming year would pass according to plan. What the expedition lacked was redundancy. There was no secondary resupply plan. There was no evacuation strategy. Communication with the outside world was impossible once the ship left. The group existed entirely on trust in a future arrival that had not been secured. At this stage, isolation was theoretical. The men and Ada functioned as a unit supported by expectation rather than certainty. The island was quiet. The risk remained abstract. Survival had not yet become a daily concern. The first winter on Wrangel Island arrived gradually. Temperatures dropped, daylight shortened, and the surrounding sea froze into a continuous surface. Travel beyond the immediate area became more difficult. The group adjusted by limiting movement and relying more heavily on stored food. Hunting continued when conditions allowed, but it was no longer predictable. By the summer of 1922, attention shifted toward the expected arrival of the resupply ship. The expedition's plans depended on it. Food stores had been calculated with this return in mind. Fuel was rationed under the same assumption. Each week that passed without a ship altered the balance of the situation. The first missed window did not immediately cause alarm. Ice conditions in the Arctic were unreliable and delays were common. The group continued with routine tasks and maintained camp structures. They conserved supplies and waited. The expectation of arrival remained intact. As summer progressed, it became clear that no ship was coming that season. Ice conditions in the surrounding waters had been unusually severe. Vessels attempting to reach the island were forced to turn back. This information, however, did not reach Wrangel Island. The group had no way of knowing the reason for the delay or whether another attempt would be made. By autumn, the implications were unavoidable. The expedition would face a second winter without additional supplies. Food reserves were already diminished. Fuel for heating and cooking was limited. Medical provisions were minimal. The margin for error narrowed quickly. Tension emerged not as panic but as calculation. Rations were reduced. Hunting became more urgent, though success varied. The men increased their efforts to trap foxes and shoot birds when possible. Ada continued her domestic work, repairing clothing and managing what food remained. Her responsibilities did not change, but their importance increased. The absence of the ship marked a shift from planned isolation to enforced isolation. The group could no longer rely on external support. Decisions now carried permanent consequences. Each choice affected the length of time the remaining supplies might last. Winter returned earlier than hoped. Darkness settled in. Movement became restricted again. The group entered the season knowing that no help was imminent. This was the point at which their situation became fixed. Leaving the island was not possible. Remaining meant enduring conditions with diminishing resources. From this moment forward, the expedition was no longer an exercise in occupation or exploration. It became a question of endurance. Survival was no longer a future concern. It was now the structure around which every day was organized. With the second winter established, the group settled into a routine shaped by necessity rather than design. Days were organized around light, weather, and the condition of their supplies. There was no longer any distinction between temporary measures and long-term planning. Everything they did was intended to extend survival. Shelter became the first priority. Their primary dwelling was reinforced against wind and drifting snow. Gaps were sealed where possible. Snow was packed against outer walls to reduce heat loss. These were incremental adjustments, repeated as conditions changed. The structure did not become comfortable, but it remained usable. Food was managed with precision. Preserved supplies were rationed carefully. Hunting and trapping supplemented what remained, though success varied widely. Some days produced meat or birds. Others produced nothing. Meals became smaller and less regular. There was no surplus. Every portion was calculated against an uncertain future. Fuel was conserved aggressively. Heating was limited to essential periods. Cooking was done quickly. Extended warmth was treated as a luxury. Cold became a constant presence rather than an event. Clothing was worn continuously, repaired repeatedly, and shared when necessary. Daily tasks were assigned without formal discussion. Each person focused on what they could still do. The men hunted when possible and maintained traps. Ada cooked, cleaned, and repaired clothing. She also managed the small routines that preserved order: washing utensils, organizing supplies, keeping track of what remained. These tasks provided structure when external markers of time were gone. Mental discipline became part of survival. The group avoided unnecessary movement. Energy was conserved not only physically but psychologically. There was little conversation about rescue. Speculation served no practical purpose. Instead, attention remained on immediate needs. Time began to lose clarity. Days blended into one another. Without sunrise or sunset to mark progression, weeks passed with little distinction. The only changes were in temperature and the gradual depletion of supplies. Records were kept sporadically. Documentation became less consistent as energy declined. Despite the conditions, the group maintained cooperation. There were no recorded conflicts during this period. Survival depended on coordination, and discipline was maintained. Each person understood that disorder would reduce their chances. This system did not make survival easier. It made it possible. By reducing life to routine, the group minimized risk. There was no comfort in this order, but it provided stability in an environment that offered none. As the second winter continued, the limits of the expedition's original structure became clear. The men's health began to decline, and their ability to hunt consistently was reduced. Illness and exhaustion affected movement and judgment. Tasks that had once been routine required more effort. Ada Blackjack's role began to change, though not by formal decision. As others weakened, she took on responsibilities she had not been trained for. Hunting in particular became unavoidable. There were periods when no one else was capable of leaving the shelter for extended time. Ada had no background in firearms. She learned through observation and necessity. The rifle became a tool rather than a symbol. Its use was deliberate and limited. Ammunition was scarce. Each shot carried weight. She practiced restraint, firing only when success was likely. Hunting trips were short and cautious. She focused on nearby areas and familiar paths. Birds provided the most reliable source of meat. Larger game was rare and unpredictable. When animals were taken, nothing was wasted. Meat, fat, and usable materials were processed carefully. This labor was slow and physically demanding, particularly in cold and wind. Tool use followed a similar pattern. Ada learned to repair equipment through repetition. Sewing skills extended beyond clothing to improvised repairs on bedding and gear. Materials were reused until they failed completely. There was no replacement. These skills were acquired without instruction manuals or guidance. There was no external standard for correctness. What mattered was whether the result functioned. Adaptation was practical rather than technical. Mistakes were costly, so they were avoided through caution rather than experimentation. Mental endurance became more significant as physical conditions worsened. Ada's routines expanded to fill time that might otherwise have been occupied by uncertainty. Tasks were repeated even when they were not strictly necessary. Order provided stability. Isolation intensified as others became less active. Responsibility concentrated. Decision-making narrowed to immediate needs. There was no broader plan beyond the next meal and the next day. This period marked a shift in the balance of the group. Survival depended increasingly on Ada's ability to perform tasks she had not been expected to do. The environment did not adjust to this change. It continued without variation. Adaptation occurred only on the human side. The passage of time on Wrangel Island became increasingly abstract. Without regular light cycles, days were measured by routine rather than clocks. The second winter extended beyond what the expedition had planned for or prepared to experience. Each week was defined by what remained possible. Seasonal changes still occurred, but they were subtle. Slight increases in light signaled the approach of spring. Temperatures shifted slowly. These changes did not bring relief. They only altered the type of effort required to survive. Melting ice created new hazards. Snow softened and refroze, complicating movement. Hunting conditions fluctuated. Birds returned with the season, offering brief improvement in food supply. Foxes remained unpredictable. Larger animals were rarely encountered. Success depended on patience and restraint. Energy was conserved for tasks with the highest likelihood of return. Health continued to decline across the group. Symptoms associated with malnutrition appeared. Weakness limited mobility. Minor injuries healed slowly or not at all. Medical supplies were insufficient to address anything beyond basic needs. Care consisted primarily of rest and ration management. Psychological pressure increased, though it was not expressed outwardly. The environment imposed sameness. There were no new stimuli. The island remained unchanged. This lack of variation eroded perception of progress. Survival became maintenance rather than movement toward an end. Ada maintained routines even as conditions worsened. She continued to prepare food, tend to supplies, and hunt when possible. These actions preserved a sense of continuity. They did not guarantee survival, but they prevented collapse. The group's awareness narrowed further. Long-term planning ceased to have meaning. Decisions were made on a daily basis. Each day completed was treated as sufficient outcome. There was no expectation attached to the next. By this stage, endurance was no longer active effort. It was persistence. The ability to continue performing necessary actions without reinforcement or external validation became the defining factor. The environment offered no indication that conditions would improve. Time passed in this way without markers, without resolution. The island remained present and indifferent. Survival continued without assurance. By the third year of isolation, the condition of the group had deteriorated beyond recovery. Prolonged malnutrition led to scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency and common in polar expeditions that relied on preserved food. Symptoms appeared gradually. Weakness increased. Joints stiffened. Wounds failed to heal. Movement became difficult. Lorne Knight was the most severely affected. His health declined steadily. He became unable to hunt or travel outside the shelter. Care consisted of basic assistance and whatever nutritional improvement could be managed. Fresh meat helped temporarily, but it was not enough to reverse the condition. Medical intervention was not possible. Recognizing the situation, the remaining men made a decision to attempt escape. In January 1923, Alan Crawford, Fred Maurer, and Milton Gall left the camp, intending to reach Siberia across the ice. The distance was extreme. Conditions were unstable. There is no evidence that they were adequately equipped for such a journey. They did not return. No confirmed record of their deaths exists beyond their disappearance. Ada Blackjack remained behind with Lorne Knight. The responsibility of care fell to her alone. She continued to provide food and maintain the shelter. Knight's condition worsened. He died in June 1923. Ada buried him near the camp. The exact details of the burial are limited in historical records, but the act is documented. After Knight's death, Ada was completely alone on Wrangel Island. There was no remaining plan. No communication. Survival depended entirely on her ability to continue the routines she had already established. She hunted birds, managed supplies, and maintained shelter without assistance. Isolation became total. There were no conversations. No shared tasks. Time continued without interruption. Ada's focus remained on survival. There is no record of emotional expression during this period. What is documented is persistence. The expedition had failed in every objective except one. A human being remained alive. This was not by design. It was the result of adaptation under conditions that offered no alternatives. After Lorne Knight's death, Ada Blackjack remained on Wrangel Island alone. The period that followed lasted several months. Records from this time are limited and come primarily from later accounts given after her return. What can be established is that she continued the same routines that had sustained the group before its collapse. Food acquisition remained the central task. Birds provided the most reliable source of meat. Ada continued to hunt cautiously, limiting her movements to familiar areas near the camp. Ammunition was used sparingly. Every successful hunt extended the period she could remain alive. Shelter maintenance continued despite physical exhaustion. Storms damaged parts of the structure, requiring repeated repairs. Cold and damp conditions persisted. There was no opportunity to relocate or improve living conditions. Stability depended on maintaining what already existed. Ada's health during this period appears to have been relatively stable compared to others who had died. Fresh meat reduced the effects of scurvy. However, she remained underweight and physically strained. There is no evidence of recovery beyond basic function. In August 1923, a ship reached Wrangel Island. The vessel was the Donaldson, sent after extended delays and difficulties caused by ice conditions. Its arrival was not dramatic. The ship approached the shore and found Ada alive near the abandoned camp. There were no celebrations recorded. The priority was evacuation. Ada gathered what remained of her belongings. She left the island without ceremony. The bodies of the men who had died were left behind, as was most of the equipment. The island returned to silence after her departure. The expedition's physical traces remained briefly before being erased by weather and time. Wrangel Island resumed its previous state of isolation. Ada returned to Alaska. Her survival was acknowledged, but it did not lead to lasting security. The event was recorded, but the conditions that led to it were not widely examined at the time. Ada Blackjack's experience on Wrangel Island became part of the historical record, though it was largely overlooked for decades. She survived 2 years in extreme isolation, without formal training in Arctic survival, and against circumstances that had proved fatal to others. Her story demonstrates the limits and possibilities of human endurance in environments indifferent to human presence. Historically, her survival challenged assumptions about gender, experience, and resilience. While the men on the expedition were expected to lead and sustain the group, it was Ada's consistent attention to routine, careful resource management, and adaptation that allowed life to continue. Survival depended on practical skill, patience, and persistence, rather than strength or ambition. Public reaction to her story was muted at the time. Media coverage focused on the lost men rather than on the woman who remained alive. In later years, Ada received recognition for her achievement, but her experience remains notable for its quiet endurance rather than dramatic heroism. There were no celebrations or monuments during her lifetime. The record is factual and restrained. Wrangel Island itself remains isolated. The human imprint of the expedition has long since faded. The island continues to exist according to its own cycles of ice, wind, and wildlife. The survival of one person did not alter the environment. It only revealed what is possible under extreme human adaptation. Ada returned to Alaska and lived a modest life. She did not gain wealth or fame. She continued her work as a seamstress and maintained her connection to family. Her survival was a private matter, quietly extraordinary. The historical significance lies not in spectacle, but in the demonstration of endurance under conditions that offer no margin for error. In the silence that follows the story, the record remains. Wrangel Island continues indifferent. One human being endured. Others did not. The environment persists unchanged. The achievement is measured not by triumph, but by continuation, by the simple act of remaining alive when all else had failed.